As all of us know, the United States has just been through a presidential election. President Barack Obama was re-elected. And the Obama administration had a number of, I think, foreign policy and counterterrorism successes during the first administration. Obviously, Osama bin Laden was killed in the special operations raid. President Obama has overseen the drawdown of troops in Iraq as well as in Afghanistan. And yet I think one of the most lasting legacies from the first term of the Obama administration may well be what U.S. officials term the Yemen model. This is sort of how it is that the U.S. is going to fight these wars against non-state actors, wars against groups like Al-Qaeda in the future. And in many ways, I think that during the first term of the Obama presidency, Yemen has become the laboratory for this sort of approach. Yemen is now a place over the past 4 years where the U.S. has tested out different ways in which it could fight Al-Qaeda. So we've seen a number of different approaches, and we've seen the Obama administration move away from what the Bush administration attempted to do with sort of large ground-scale invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. And I think everybody who spends any time in Yemen would agree that any sort of a boots-on-the-ground approach to Yemen would be a disaster. But there is an organization there, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, that's actively targeting the U.S. And so what I'd like to do today in sort of these opening remarks that we have is to just go through the past 4 years and look at what the U.S. has done and look at what Al-Qaeda has done. Almost 4 years ago, a little less than 4 years ago, President Obama, of course, was being inaugurated, sworn into office here in Washington, D.C. I was, as I'm sure many of you, watching the inauguration. I was at home in Princeton, New Jersey, and I was watching it, and as I was watching the president be sworn into office, I was also sort of trying to multitask and trying to keep up with some of my studies, going through a stack of Arabic papers that I printed off but hadn't had a chance to look at. And one of these was a printout from a jihadi forum, an Islamist chat room, if you will. And it announced the formation of this new group, a group that was calling itself Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And along with that announcement, it was just sort of a little banner announcement. And then it also said that the new deputy commander of this organization was an individual by the name of Saeed al-Shihri. And that Saeed al-Shihri had actually been a former detainee within Guantanamo Bay. So it was very jarring to watch President Obama, who campaigned and made, I think, the second bill that he signed, his intention to close Guantanamo Bay, to see the president being sworn in and yet have this piece of paper in front of me that suggested to me, and I think has later turned out to be true, that the president was going to have a great challenge and would ultimately be unable to close Guantanamo Bay because of some of the things that we saw from people like Saeed al-Shihri, who returned to join Al-Qaeda after their time in Guantanamo and then going through the Saudi rehabilitation program. So really from the beginning of President Obama's first term, that's also the beginning of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. There's a long and a deep history. Much of it's in the book, which hopefully is more of a story than a history. But again, they're really linked, I think, in both the organization's mind as well as in the minds of the officials who are serving in this first administration. What we saw then, of course, on Christmas Day 2009 is that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula was able to put a would-be suicide bomber on a plane over Detroit who came very, very close to bringing down that plane. And that, I think, was, if sort of the initial thing in January of 2009, where Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula announced that this merger between the Yemeni and Saudi branches, that was the opening, and this was really the wake-up call on Christmas Day 2009, when this Nigerian student, who, of course, we all remember, the so-called underwear bomber, came so close to bringing down that airliner. Thankfully for all of us, for the U.S., for everyone, he was unsuccessful. But this hasn't stopped Al-Qaeda from targeting the United States. There was the cartridge bomb plot in 2010, which again was thankfully uncovered. And then earlier this year, we know that the individual Ibrahim Asiri, who we believe to be the head bomb maker within Al-Qaeda. He designed a new bomb that was sort of an underwear bomb 2.0, if you will, that had a bit of redundancy built into it. So one of the failures of the underwear bomber on the Christmas Day attempted attack was that he was unable to detonate the explosives, which is very stable but difficult to actually detonate, to ignite. And Asiri went to school on some of his past failures, and I think this is one of the things that actually speaks to what Al-Qaeda as an organization has been doing, is that they tend to learn from their past mistakes. And there is some bureaucracy within the organization, but it's not the type of bureaucracy that we have in Washington, or at least what I see from my perch from a few hundred miles north of what we have in Washington. And so they are able to adapt and to learn fairly quickly. And so while Al-Qaeda has been targeting the United States, the U.S. has also been targeting Al-Qaeda. And in fact, in December of 2009, the Obama administration opened their campaign of bombing attacks against what they believe to be Al-Qaeda targets in Yemen. So on December 14, 2009, this is obviously about 11 days before the Christmas Day attack, Secretary of State Clinton added Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula to the terrorist list, named them an official terrorist organization, and then 3 days later the U.S. carried out its first attack. So it was in southern Yemen, and Ibrahim mentioned this in his remarks. It was on the village of Al-Majla. And what the U.S. thought was that there was an Al-Qaeda training camp, and they knew some of the operatives who were there, and so they had U.S. naval ships off the coast of Yemen that fired missiles equipped with cluster bombs into what they believed to be an Al-Qaeda training camp. Unfortunately for the U.S., this turned out to be a Bedouin village in which a few Al-Qaeda members were hiding. There were 55 casualties during the first round of attacks. So this happened sort of in the pre-dawn darkness in Yemen on December 17th. Most of the Bedouins were sort of living in these tattered blue tarps in brush lean-tos. It's a very difficult place to get to, very remote. And so when the bombs came in the morning, everyone was sleeping. Of course, the destruction was just amazing. One of the individuals who's quoted in the book is a tribal sheikh from near Al-Majla in southern Yemen, in Abiyan, and he went to this sort of gravel shelf where the Bedouins had been staying, and he walked around, and he says, you know, the destruction was it was grotesque and it was horrible, but there was so much flesh around and so much just meat that you couldn't tell if it was human, if it was goat, if it was sheep. And this is, in Yemen, this has been a very powerful recruiting tool for Al-Qaeda. When you have images and when you have pictures like this, and when Al-Qaeda can sort of caption these with "Made in the USA," this becomes something that I think is a very powerful recruiting tool. So what we've seen over the past 3 to 4 years is that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula has grown quite quickly, going from, if we say look at Christmas Day 2009, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula is about 200 or 300 individuals. At least that's our best guess based on estimates both by the Yemeni government and by the U.S. government. And I think those estimates are probably about right. Now, 3 years on, almost 3 years on, the group has more than tripled in size. So we're seeing John Brennan, who's estimated that the group is now 1,000 fighters. There are individuals in Yemen who put it as high as 6,000. I think the 6,000 is probably quite a bit inflated. But nevertheless, there has been a significant increase in the number of Al-Qaeda operatives. And I think one of the key questions that we have to ask is why? Why has Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula grown so strong, so fast? In other parts of the world, we've seen Al-Qaeda that's suffering, but in Yemen, they seem to be growing, and so why is that? And this has been something that a lot of people who went to Yemen have looked at and have debated. And I think it gets, there's not just one driver of radicalization. There's not just one cause for why Al-Qaeda has more than tripled in size in just 3 years. Some people point to economics. I think that certainly has a role. But I think it's a bit misleading to claim, as John Brennan did earlier this year, that the U.S. sees no evidence that U.S. airstrikes, U.S. drone strikes have led to an increase in the number of operatives within al-Qaeda. I think that's either incredibly naive or deliberately misleading. And one of the potential reasons for that may be that the U.S. policymakers in Yemen just don't get out and don't interact with a lot of Yemenis. There are obviously very real security concerns. We all know the situation in Benghazi and Libya. Obviously, U.S. diplomats abroad are a target. I was just in Yemen a couple of weeks ago. I visited the U.S. Embassy. It's very, very difficult to get in, and once you're in, you don't really get out. When I first started going to Yemen about a decade ago, you had U.S. diplomats who were based all throughout the city. They would travel throughout the country. Now the situation is that U.S. diplomats all live in essentially what's a little green zone in Sana'a. So you have them staying at the Sheraton Hotel, which is right above the embassy in sort of the secure corridor, and then going to work at the embassy, and then going back to the Sheraton Hotel and back and forth. And when you don't get out even into the capital city, it's very, very difficult to ascertain what's actually going on there in the country. And so I really do think that, you know, there are, I guess, let me put it this way, there are a couple of different ways that this debate has been talked about. In the U.S., we tend to talk about drones and we tend to talk about the technology. And that, I think, derives a little bit from the fact that neither the Bush administration or the Obama administration really made an effective legal or moral or ethical framework. And this is something that I think has been a real failure of American leadership from both parties. I think when you look back into American history, whether it's in the Supreme Court, whether it's George Washington, our leaders have a history of looking at the situation at the moment, but also keeping one eye and looking far down into the future and realizing how the great impact that precedent can have. And I think that's something that both the Bush administration and the Obama administration have failed on with drones. But that's an argument, I think, for legal scholars to make. And that's not one that I have the training to really press any further. The argument that I would make is one of effectiveness. And that is that drones in Yemen, despite the Obama administration's rhetoric that what they want to do is disrupt, dismantle, and defeat al-Qaeda, that it's not drones or airstrikes that are really sort of driving al-Qaeda. So in that sense, John Brennan, I think, is correct. But it's the civilian casualties. It's the individuals who are being killed along with the al-Qaeda targets. It's the tribe. When I was in Yemen, I was talking to someone who's very, very close to al-Qaeda, and he said, look, you know, there's a difference between Yemen and Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, al-Qaeda are Arabs in a non-Arab country. In Yemen, they're Yemenis in Yemen. And so they move around much easier in Yemen than they did in Afghanistan. And also they have many more identities. So in Yemen, they can be a member of al-Qaeda and a tribesman. And they can be known locally. Maybe some people know them as a tribesman, and yet others see them, the U.S., for instance, would see them as an al-Qaeda member. And so when the U.S. targets the al-Qaeda member, the U.S. thinks it's killing an al-Qaeda member, and maybe it is. But who's being killed on the ground and who Yemenis are seeing being killed is in fact a tribesman. And I think this is a challenge that the U.S. and the Obama administration have not really solved. And I would argue that the drones and the airstrikes have not actually solved the problem. And in fact, like Ibrahim, they've actually exacerbated the problem a great deal within Yemen. And so, not to go on too long, but just let me close with this last scenario. After the Christmas Day attack on 2009, President Obama asked his staff to imagine what would happen if al-Qaeda had been successful. And I think that's a very good exercise. And if today al-Qaeda were able to carry out an attack, even a fairly small one, not on the scale of September 11th, but on the scale of, say, Christmas Day 2009, how would the U.S. respond? Many people, I would put myself in this camp, think that a large-scale ground invasion of Yemen would be a mistake, and yet the U.S. has been bombing Yemen for the past 3 years, and it really doesn't seem to have had the impact that the U.S. would like it to have. One of the arguments, I think, has been that if the U.S. is able to bomb al-Qaeda, keep al-Qaeda back on its heels in Yemen, then al-Qaeda won't be able to sort of plot, plan, and launch attacks against the United States. And I think the last 3 years have shown that that is not indeed the case. In fact, we've seen this year that the U.S. has carried out, at least by my count, anywhere from 37 to 50 airstrikes on suspected al-Qaeda targets. And those are according to the anonymous officials that we all see quoted in the Washington Post or in the New York Times. Those are an effort to kill 10 to 15 individuals who the U.S. believes are plotting against the U.S. So I think one of two things is true. Either the drone strikes aren't as accurate as we're all told that they are, or the U.S. is doing something different than what it says it's doing, that is targeting more than just the 10 to 15 individuals. And so what would any administration then be able to do if al-Qaeda were to carry out an attack today? Because if a large-scale ground invasion is sort of foolish and would be disastrous and is really off the table, do they just have another sort of missile surge, which we've already seen, which doesn't really seem to be effective? And so this is, I think, my major critique is that this Yemen model that has been designed by individuals within the Obama administration is not actually disrupting, dismantling, and defeating al-Qaeda, at least in Yemen. In Yemen, what's happening on the ground is that al-Qaeda is actually expanding and the problem is being exacerbated. So while Ibrahim sort of finished on a very optimistic note, I'll bring us all back to earth with a rather pessimistic note.